One. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness podcast. This is your host, Brandon DeCruz, and today I have the pleasure of having one of my good friends, Dr. Scott Stevenson, back on the show to expand upon a series essentially that we've been doing, which has been on fat loss and weight loss drugs. And we've been doing this over the last 2 months. So if you guys have yet to listen to the other conversations and podcast episodes in this series that Scott and I have been doing just recently, I would really advise you guys to first go back and listen to episode 117, which was on the science of fat burners, and then also episode 120, which was our thyroid hormone masterclass, where we discuss the relationship between energy availability, carbohydrate intake, body composition, refeeds, and thyroid health. And I've asked Scott to come back on the podcast this week to talk about the hottest class of weight loss drugs that everyone has been discussing pretty much the last year or two, which are the GLP-1 receptor agonists, or they're also referred to as analogs. So on today's episode, we're going to focus mostly on the most popular one that's out today, which is semaglutide, which also goes by the names Ozempic, which is used for the treatment of type 2 diabetes, and Wegovy, which is approved for the treatment of obesity and to help induce weight loss. So over the past 2 to 3 years, since semaglutide became approved for weight loss, I've dug into this topic and tried to learn as much as possible about it, as I continue to get more and more individuals contacting me for coaching who have either taken this drug previously, and before they came to me, essentially, before we got in contact for coaching, and essentially what ended up happening was they regained the weight that they lost after discontinuing its use. Then I have other individuals in the situation that they're taking the drug currently and they want to stay on it. And then I have another category of individuals who are still using this compound currently, but who wish to either taper down their dose to a maintenance level or to discontinue its use completely due to the expense of the drug, which is quite high, to be honest with you guys, or because of the fact that they're having trouble continuing to grit through some of the unfavorable side effects it's causing them to experience, which we will go through later on in this podcast. And I've had many new clients in one of these three categories contact me for coaching. And that's why I've had to take such an interest in these drugs, as I wanted to understand their actions, their benefits, their effects, and their drawbacks, so that I could help these individuals and these clients to the best of my ability, regardless of their goal. And one thing I've gotten feedback from clients who have used this drug is that I've been really helpful in helping them to improve their nutrition, their training, their activity levels, and their lifestyle, which has either allowed them to get more out of less, meaning we've been able to either back down their weekly dose, yet continue to get results, or they haven't had to do the dose escalation that many people that are using this as what's called a monotherapy, meaning that they're only utilizing or only relying on semaglutide or a GLP-1 receptor agonist. They're having to go through this titration, which often in the literature or even in clinics looks like going from 0.25 milligrams all the way up to 2.4 milligrams per week. I've also been able to help those who have used the drugs prior to contacting me to finally lose some of the excess weight and body fat they had gained after discontinuing the drug. So a lot of times I've had situations where people have utilized the drug for, say, 6 months, and they've lost a substantial or significant amount of weight, and then they've gotten off the drug. And 6 months has went by, and they've regained either all the weight that they had lost, or they've regained all that weight and then some. So then they contact me because they've really tried to either maintain that weight loss, or they've tried yet again to do it through diet and lifestyle, where they've tried to rectify the situation essentially. They've tried to lose some of the weight that they had regained, and they were just finding it hard without the accountability piece, without the guidance, and without the support of a nutrition professional. So the goal of today's conversation with Scott is to go through the actions of GLP-1 and to empower you guys with education so that you can decide if these are for you or not. But I do want to make it clear from the jump that in no way, shape, or form are Scott and I here to tell you that you need to use these drugs or that you shouldn't, as that's the type of guidance that we could only provide someone which we work with and have a one-on-one coaching relationship with. So before I dive into the actions of GLP-1, Scott, is there anything else you wanted to add into the intro before we commence this conversation?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me back on. I enjoy
Absolutely.
our chats. The thing that I would suggest, because there's probably some people out there who fall into the one or more of the categories that you just mentioned of the clients that you've worked with, it's pretty much standard fare for most allopathic Western physicians, MDs, to not have nutritional guidance as part of what they do, what they prescribe. That's absolutely necessary because this compound, this drug works so well, and we're going to talk about this, for weight loss simply because you just don't want to eat. It basically is as close to anything I can think of as far as a magic bullet just for keeping hunger at bay, so that people will automatically have that caloric deficit, which is mandatory for weight loss, which means that you don't have to have those behavioral techniques in play. as you make your way down to that weight loss. So it basically gets you to your goal without having almost any idea as to how to maintain it without the drug. From the perspective of someone who's trying to deal a drug, for instance, it's going to make you dependent upon it, so to speak. This is the one. This is the one that will. This is why this is, from what I've read, I haven't been able to fact check those numbers, but this is the semaglutide, for instance, is the GLP-1 agonist that everyone's talking about. It's the Wegovy or Ozempic, and that's the #1 selling drug, I think, in the U.S., maybe not even the world, everywhere. And Trulicity, which is another GLP-1 agonist, is #4. So this, alongside the number of other diabetic drugs, make up like half of the top 10 selling drugs. And we could talk about this in the entire the podcast, but diabetes and obesity is obviously something that could be treated with behavioral intervention too. So,
100%.
but get on board with a nutritionist, or find a coach or whatever. If you're going to do this, if your doctor's prescribing this for you, plead your doctor to write your referral to a nutritionist or someone, an exercise specialist, whatever it may be, so you can get the behavioral technique. Because otherwise, basically, you're being sent out into the ocean on a one-way trip on the ship with no way to get back, and you're just going to go out there, and when and if you decide to discontinue the pharmaceutical because you can't afford it or whatever other reasons. I don't know if there's even been cases where people no longer, and this would be just the complete the hypocritical nature. I hope this never happens, but if someone says, well, you're no longer a candidate for the drug because you're no longer overweight or obese, so you don't get it anymore. Well, they're just going to revert back.
We
I
are
hope that
seeing that
happens.
within actual, not the medical practice, but actually insurance. Sometimes people
Of
are not
course,
qualified any longer, and
of
so they're
course.
getting it pulled from being able to be not only prescribed, but also for them to be able to have it insured. And so, yes, I've
Okay.
had 2 clients thus far over the years that qualified for it initially. So they were at that time when Ozempic, or rather, yeah, when Wegovy rather was initially put forth in 2021, they qualified. They were over a 35 BMI.
Mm-hmm.
Really, to get into kind of like the nuances of it, you have to have a 30 or greater BMI, or now it's a 27 or greater BMI with one of other comorbidities. The most prominent one is type 2 diabetes. So I had 2 clients that were over a 35 BMI. They lost substantial weight loss. They got under a 30 BMI, and in their experience, they just told me that insurance no longer covered it. So the expense that it went
Right.
from was intense at that time. I had one woman that was paying $1,400 a month for her prescription, which
Yeah.
is immense. I mean, if we think about that, this is a drug that people use for extended periods of time. If you look at the trials, the
Right.
most popular trial is 68 weeks of semaglutide, which is the step 1 trial. So if we do the back calculations of that, that's 17 months, 16 or 17 months right there. So think about that expense extrapolated over all those months. 1,400. We're looking at in the realm of somewhere $18,000-$20,000 a year. That's an immense expense for anyone.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I cringe to think, because this is something that's so important for people, how they look, how they feel. And once you get there, and all the listeners who maybe have done contests and gotten down to a new body image, a new place body fat wise, letting go of that for the first time and coming back, that can be just psychologically devastating. And for someone who maybe for the first time has undergone the wonderful transformative changes of dropping down from being obese, and then to have that then be taken away from them, they're going to do, they're basically just they're easy pickings for pharmaceutical industries. Are going to sell drugs that cost a lot. I don't know what the actual cost of production of these are, but it's a matter of supply and demand, and the demand is going to be tremendous for someone who's made those movements forward in terms of weight loss. And then no longer, I was hoping that I wasn't right, but you confirmed what I suspected, that the insurance
Unfortunately,
company, I mean, the obviously medical practice guidelines don't always dictate what the insurance companies do, but this is akin to someone who has type 1 diabetes,
not being able
who
to get
gets
insulin.
to not get it because you've got your glucose under control for a couple of weeks. Well, I still need it. All the things that were pre-existing from my obesity are still there. We're treating the pre-existing conditions that led to the condition of having obesity and whatever else comorbidities may be involved. And it just comes down to money. So anyway, that's exactly. Get with the nutritionist, get with the trainer, grab a team, create behavioral support, do all those things alongside of this, because this can't shoulder the entire burden. I mean, unless maybe you're just independently wealthy, and then there's a possibility that would happen. But even then,
Yeah, the
we'll
best
talk about.
approach is always multifactorial. So we can
I
never
think
just
so.
look at diet in isolation, or training in isolation, or movement in isolation, or pharmaceuticals in isolation. The best approach is a multifaceted approach. And the same can be said about having a multidisciplinary team. So oftentimes I will be working with a client one-on-one from a nutrition and training and lifestyle perspective. They will have a physician in their corner, whether that be an endocrinologist or that be a medical practitioner that can prescribe these medications. And then they will also have sometimes a psychiatrist, a psychologist, something from the mental perspective, because there is a lot of associations between obesity as well as depression, anxiety, other mental health disorders. And so this is where we can really work as a team to really get this person not only on the right path, but to get them to their goal in a manner where they're able to lose fat and keep it off. Because it's not just about getting to that end goal and looking at it as a finish line. This is a checkpoint along your destination. This is a place that you want to get to and continue moving past and continuing to progress. But as we move into the podcast, I want to give you guys, for anyone out there that doesn't know what glucagon like peptide 1 is and what it does, I want to give you guys a little primer on its actions. So glucagon like peptide 1, aka GLP-1, is a gut-derived peptide hormone that is naturally secreted when we ingest food and in response to eating. So GLP-1 belongs to a family of hormones called incretins and has a few main actions in the body which apply both to the naturally secreted GLP-1 that we see the production from when we ingest food, but also to the exogenously used GLP-1, such as when someone takes a weekly injection of semaglutide, or even there is oral forms or oral preparations of semaglutide like Rybelsus. And so GLP-1 enhances insulin secretion from the beta cells of the pancreas in response to glucose, which is why GLP-1 drugs are used. And its primary use initially was in type 2 diabetics. So it's going to help with insulin sensitivity. They also decrease postprandial glucagon secretion, which it does through its interactions with the alpha cells. It also reduces hepatic glucose production from the liver, which improves blood glucose control and reduces hyperglycemia. Then in the stomach, GLP-1 delays the rate of gastric emptying, which helps to slow down the transit of food, which leads to greater feelings of fullness and better glycemic control. Then it also signals to the brain, right in the hypothalamus of the brain, that we are full, and it helps to reduce appetite and promote satiety. So all these actions that GLP-1 has, both from an endogenous, so a naturally secreted form, but as well as an exogenous, so a pharmaceutically, made peptide. These are all actions that are going to help to decrease blood sugar. It's going to help with blood glucose control. Then it's also going to help with increasing feelings of fullness as well as decreasing food consumption. So, Scott, can you describe what an agonist is in terms of, really when it comes down to it? We're focusing on GLP-1, which is on semaglutide, which is a GLP-1 agonist. So can you first tell us what an agonist is and perhaps provide some examples of other agonists that many would be familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, agonist is, so when most drugs, in this case specifically, semaglutide is a GLP-1 analog. So it means it's analogous to or similar to the endogenously produced peptide hormone itself. So many drugs, I don't know if it's most now, but a large percentage are derived from things we found in nature or things we found in the body that bind to a receptor. And if something binds to a receptor and activates it, we call that an agonist. Kind of agitates it and acts like the endogenous chemical for which the receptor has at least been. Sometimes we'll find receptors that have multiple things can bind to them. Then that's an agonist, or we have other term that many people are probably familiar with, an antagonist. So in this case, we're looking at something that agonizes, is an agonist to the receptor. Interestingly enough, for instance, there's another class of drugs, I don't know if we're going to get into, that is involved with reducing the breakdown of glucagon-like peptide.
You're talking about
GLP-1.
DPP-4.
Yeah, so the dipeptidyl peptidase 4 inhibitors. So GLP-1, I think I'm going to be jumping ahead, has a really, really short half-life. It's a fascinating compound. It's actually released from the alpha cells. There's a pro-glucagon molecule that is the precursor molecule for glucagon, GLP-1, and another similar molecule called GLP-2. And it also gets released from the lower small intestine and the large intestine. And there's actually GLP-1 that gets released in the brain. And when it gets released, this DPP4 enzyme, it's a peptidase, dipeptidyl, it breaks down the GLP-1 really rapidly. And that's found ubiquitously. It's all over the place. So one strategy that hasn't proven to be terribly effective, but sometimes I believe it can be co-prescribed. If you're doing something other than monotherapy, this would be, a ditherapy, so to speak. They could give a dipeptidyl peptidase 4 inhibitor to try to prolong the GLP-1 half-life. So anyway, we've got agonists that activate and antagonists. And interestingly enough, when that DPPT4 breaks down GLP-1, one of the breakdown products is an antagonist to the receptor. So we've got a really complicated system, even if we're just looking microscopically at GLP-1, because it normally has a very, very short, like the half-life is considered to be 2 minutes, at least in the bloodstream. Now, what's going up in the brain is somewhat of a mystery. I haven't really found any reviews of the experts have been able to say, we know exactly what's going on there, but it's produced all over the body. So when you're using something like semaglutide, which has a very, very long half-life, it's basically an altered version. I think maybe three different amino acids, they've altered it so that it is no longer a good substrate for that enzyme. So it stays in the bloodstream much, much longer. Same is true of the oral version. It doesn't break down nearly as quickly. And then it has a half-life that allows you to inject the injectable version once a week, which is much longer than 2 minutes. So right there, if you just think about pharmacological, what we're doing, we're taking a hormone that in the body normally is very, very fine, very, very short acting, so you can very quickly fine tune what's going on literally a minute by minute basis, how meals are processed by the gastrointestinal system, and what's going on up in our brain in terms of whether we're satiated, satiety between meals, and all those sorts of things. And now we've got a drug that lasts for a week, roughly, in terms of its effect, and it's constantly there. So those receptors are being bombarded continuously throughout a week's time, which is very different. So we're creating we're disallowing the normal regulation that GLP-1 does, and it's just saying, nope, we're going to activate with this agonist all the time, and we're going to inhibit appetite all the time.
Yeah, so I kind of see it. Well, first of all, just to recap that for the audience, essentially what Scott's alluding to is the fact that GLP-1 receptor agonists are essentially they're synthetic chemicals that mimic the action of natural GLP-1 hormones. And so, how these medications and these compounds work is they bind to and activate the GLP-1 receptors in the body. However, it's at essentially super physiological doses, so we can kind of analogize it to testosterone binding to the androgen receptor. If you're using exogenous testosterone, you're having an elevation that is much longer than your transient and diurnal testosterone production. So this is just essentially superseding some of the natural ebbs and flows of natural hormone secretion and production. But Scott, next, what I would like you to go through, would you be able to tell us about the hormones besides GLP-1 that are involved in the actions of these drugs and what they do? And really, primarily, what I would like you to speak about is insulin and glucagon, just so the audience knows exactly what the actions of those hormones are in the body and maybe how they can be involved within this class of drugs.
Okay, I mean, gastrointestinal physiology is absolutely fascinating. So our pancreas is a very important organ in the body. It has endocrine functions, so it produces hormones, insulin and glucagon being those two. And talk about regulation. Obviously, if you can't take in nutrients, you're not long for this world. So it's very, very important to be able to regulate that and to know when you're hungry. And I mean, this is just giving perspective when you're using a drug like semaglutide. We're basically in a very powerful way ablating the hunger signal, which normally has lots of counter-regulatory and redundant systems. So people talk about two different types of cells. The beta cells are often noted in terms of insulin release, and the glucagon cells, or the alpha cells, where glucagon is released. So when we have, in particular, glucose, amino acids also do this, coming in into the bloodstream, the pancreas registers this and releases insulin. And people talk about insulin shuttling nutrients. It doesn't really just shuttle them in, but when it binds to its receptor, it's a very anabolic hormone in terms of both fat cells and skeletal muscle cells, and it in various ways brings nutrients, turns on the process that brings nutrients into cells. Its counterpart, at least in terms of glucose, is glucagon. So when glucose is present, insulin is released. The way I used to always teach us in anatomy and physiology is when glucose is gone, when
Glucagon is
glucose
released.
is low, glucagon, glucagon. So we'd send glucagon, and that would trigger then hepatic glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis. It actually activates hormone-sensitive lipase to free up free fatty acids, inhibits lipogenesis. So glucagon helps free up nutrients to be used. So it's the opposite of quote unquote storage hormone, which insulin is, which helps bring glucose and other nutrients into the cells because they're available. So glucagon is something you're going to see, although you will see glucagon released in response to amino acids as well, and it has an appetite reducing effect, an anorectic effect in the brain. And real quick, just to like gloss over this, there's another hormone that comes from another type of cells, the delta cells, called somatostatin, and it puts the brake on both insulin and glucagon. And GLP-1, our hormone of the day, is released from the pancreas, the small intestine, or the small intestine, large intestine, and the brain. And there are also other gastric hormones like gastrin, cholecystokinin, which is increases gastric or gallbladder contractions. It has an exocrine effect on the pancreas too. There's secretin, comes from the small intestine, and a good friend, ghrelin, which is appetite. It's kind of the opposite of GLP-1 in many ways. It reduces insulin, whereas GLP-1 increases insulin. The reason why the incretins, GLP-1 being one of those, are called incretins is that they at least in vitro, when you have cells in isolation, beta cells in the pancreas, it will create an increment in insulin. So that's why it's called an incretin. Ghrelin does the opposite. So all these lists of hormones are all playing a symphony of control in terms of our appetite, in terms of gastric motility, in terms of pancreas, both endocrine function. So the hormones feedback, inhibit one another, cause other hormones to be released, less or more so, and as well as the exocrine function. So what enzymes are coming from the pancreas to do the chemical digestion that happens in the stomach and the small intestine as things are being absorbed. So it's a beautiful interplay. But glucagon and insulin are the main two people talk about. But these other hormones are also important too. But our hammer here is GLP-1.
Absolutely. So before we get into that, what I do want to do is you just mentioned insulin, which is a hormone that I've had a big interest in. My father was a type 2 diabetic, so I was learning about insulin dosing as well as insulin physiology when I was like 12 years old. So this has been a hobby horse of mine for years. And one topic I did want to cover before we go into GLP-1 is the fact that insulin actually acts as a satiety hormone. And there's a lot of individuals within our space who make claims that insulin actually causes an increase in hunger, which is one of the ideas or the main ideas put forth by those who promote what's referred to as the carbohydrate model or carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. And I think it's important to cover because A, it's an action of insulin that many are unaware of. And if insulin increase appetite, drugs like semaglutide and the other GLP-1 analogs wouldn't be as effective for weight loss and appetite suppression as they increase insulin secretion around meals, which helps to signal satiety to the brain. And also, as we covered in our recent thyroid masterclass podcast, insulin increases leptin secretion, and leptin is one of our main satiety hormones. So although I believe that the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity has been thoroughly debunked by all the well-controlled research that's been done especially by Dr. Kevin Hall of the NIH, and also in the real world Scott, think about how many thousands of bodybuilders we've seen and just anecdotally and we've known that have gotten into contest condition and arguably the best shape in the world by using and consuming mostly high carbohydrate diets. But I have a lot of people that are in lifestyle clients and that are in the general population that they've really heard a lot in this space about insulin being a fat storage hormone, insulin being an appetite increasing hormone. And the facts of the matter is that appetite or that insulin actually has appetite suppressing effects, and the research reinforces that quite heavily. So years ago, you actually introduced me to something. I don't know if you remember this, but you introduced me to the insulin index of foods. This was something in one of your initial books, but you did so in the context of carbohydrate loading. But another aspect of this index is they looked at insulin and satiety values. So the insulin index of foods, for anyone out there that isn't familiar with it, was developed through a study by Holt and colleagues by taking 240 calories worth of different foods and testing how much of an insulin elevation they cause within 2 hours of eating these foods. This research group also is the same group that developed what's referred to as the satiety index of foods, which is a very famous study and index that I use in practice, honestly, to help with food choices and really helping with the satiety of the diets that I create for clients. Now, the research found that many of the foods that had the highest insulin index were amongst the foods that scored the highest on the satiety index in terms of what they referred to as their fullness factor, which was essentially their ability to induce satiety and reduce hunger. So examples of foods that score both high on the insulin index and on the satiety index are potatoes, which have a high insulin index, but they were also the single most satiating food source on the satiety index when tested against other isocaloric food sources. Another proof of principle in terms of insulin helping with satiety is that protein sources that have a high insulin index, including protein sources like animal sources like beef, as well as dairy sources like whey or Greek yogurt, are some of the most satiating foods that we can consume. So in a 1996 clinical trial, researchers looked at the relationships between post-meal satiety, insulin responses, and subsequent calorie intake, and found a negative correlation between insulin responses and subsequent calorie intake, which suggests that foods that produce a higher insulin response are associated with less food intake as well as greater satiety. And the researchers also noted that this result is consistent with previous findings that carbohydrate-rich foods are more satisfying and more satiating than fat-rich foods. Now, if we look even further on the research on protein, which is known as the most satiating macronutrient, so many people put that out there, even in the low-carb community, they'll say protein is the most satiating. And we know that a lot of times some of the effects of low-carbohydrate diets are because they're increasing their protein intake. However, what's interesting is that if you look at protein in isolation, you'll find even further evidence as to how insulin secretion, which is what GLP-1 drugs promote, suppresses appetite. So in a 2010 study, researchers compared 4 different types of protein shakes to see how they affect satiety and found that the more of an insulin increase the protein shake caused, the less calories were eaten at that next meal. And in this study, they found that there was a strong relationship between self-reported and self-rated appetite, postprandial insulin response from that protein source, and calorie intake at lunch. And so what they found specifically in this study, which is interesting because this is the most prominent protein source now, but this is a study from the early 2010s, is that whey protein produced a greater insulin response, reduced appetite, and decreased ad libitum calorie intake at a subsequent meal compared with all the other protein sources, indicating a potential role for appetite suppression and weight loss in individuals. And when we look at insulinogenic protein sources like whey protein or Greek yogurt or beef, we see that it has multiple effects that lead to lower hunger levels and higher satiety levels, both of which help to regulate our energy intake. So if we actually look at, and there's been randomized controlled trials on this, there is, and I come from the supplement industry, so I had to know this like inside and out. Well, if you look at like the clinical trials on whey protein, we see that consuming whey protein, even in a dieted state, leads to higher levels of GLP-1 secretion. Now, this is endogenous GLP-1 secretion, helps with GIP release and CCK production. So these are all satiety hormones, which the ingestion of whey protein is helping to increase. Then we also had a meta-analysis that looked at the associations between post-meal insulin and blood glucose responses, appetite and calorie intake in normal weight and overweight individuals. And their results found that in normal weight individuals, there was a positive relationship between insulin secretion and satiety, meaning the greater the insulin secretion a food source caused, the greater impact eating that food had on suppressing hunger and increasing appetite. And so, when we look at this and we see, GLP-1 agonists like semaglutide, they were originally designed for the treatment of type 2 diabetes and to attenuate the insulin resistance, yet they started to notice that even at lower doses of like, say, 0.5 to 1 milligram per week, that they were causing significant weight loss in type 2 diabetics. So it makes sense that insulin secretion caused by GLP-1 drugs not only improves blood glucose control, but also appetite regulation. So I just wanted to really dive into that before we get into all the downstream effects of GLP-1, because a lot of times people put things in buckets and they look at things in silos, and you have to look at the mechanisms of action behind a drug. And so there's individuals in the space that you'll hear promoting and claiming that insulin secretion promotes an increase in hunger and appetite, yet in the next breath, these same individuals promote the use of GLP-1 agonists And they don't realize that they're literally contradicting themselves when making these statements. But if you really think about the mechanism of action, one of the main mechanisms of action that has downstream implications and positive benefits are the fact that GLP-1 drugs help with the secretion of insulin, and that's also having an appetite suppressing effect. So we can't, just look at GLP-1 drugs in isolation, like, oh, it does this, and let's ignore the insulin, claims that these individuals have made. No, we have to look at the entire story. So it's really important when we go into some of these, because a lot of people, they only present evidence that fits their narrative. So they'll talk about GLP-1 drugs and the benefits that they have, but then they ignore some of the other physiological mechanisms going on. So I always like to tease that through and really give people a more nuanced perspective. But now that we've covered what GLP-1 is, what it does.
Can I throw a couple of things in
absolutely.
there? At a very simple way of looking at it, if you think about insulin as quote unquote a storage hormone, so it's signaling that nutrients are available to be stored, and it's actually facilitating that happening. It makes sense then that the brain would also recognize, hey, we've just got nutrients to be stored. We're going to be satiated. We're going to have some satiety that's going to last here. So that makes sense. And the other thing I think too is that there are foods where you can get a cephalic release of insulin, where it's a trigger food for someone and it's a binge food, and then they just go to town on it. And I think
what is that often accompanied by, Scott? It's not just carbs in isolation that are secreting insulin. It's usually hyperpalatable foods that are carb and fat bombs.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's, I think, part of what complicates this is, those, like, I think the insulin index for ice cream is really high. If I recall, it's way up there, right?
So is sorbet.
Yeah, sure, right? But hardly zero fat in sorbet. I love sorbet. That's probably what works for me. But I think ice cream, gosh, if you go, like, there's like half an aisle in the grocery store in the refrigerator, it's all ice cream. It's just amazing. People love ice cream and variants thereof. So that's also part of what's going on. And there's a sociological, psychological factor that's involved too, I think. And the last thing I'll add to that too, as far as just like contextualizing all of this, if you look at what happens along the course of GLP-1 treatment when someone's losing body fat and their insulin is going down, we do, on average, we're going to see this just because of the fact they're eating less or getting more insulin sensitive, so your insulin levels will drop. GLP-1, this is a very complex scenario, so it's just like saying it's black and white is not gonna cover all bases. So GLP-1 is in one sense stimulating insulin release, but it's also slowing gastric emptying, and then tending to, in the real world, mean that you eat less, which means less insulin. So while it's counterbalancing its effects, which is what all these hormones are doing. Like I said, it's a symphony. They're doing one thing to increase one hormone and doing one thing that would then have a counter regulatory effect on that hormone at the same time. And then if we're talking about over the course of time, over the course of a diet where you're eating less, then, to try to say that insulin does black and white this in all situations, it's just spitting in the wind, I think. So Absolutely. Anyway, I just wanted to throw some thoughts in there to contextualize that, because I'm glad you brought, it's an important section, I think, this insulin model.
No, absolutely, because that's something that's still prominent, especially because I'm mostly in the nutrition space. So that's something we still hear, and it's like, yeah, but these same individuals are now hopping up on the GLP-1 train, and maybe for those that aren't very well versed, it's easy because someone sounds confident. Oftentimes, and I encounter this with many of the clients that I work with, they're hearing a lot of talking heads. There's a lot of individuals in our space that are content creators. They're not coaches. They're not really working with people one-on-one. So they hear a content creator that has these nice flashy reels and things like that, and they're making a lot of claims, and they might be promoting a low carbohydrate diet, keeping insulin levels low. These are all great things. Don't get me wrong. Then also GLP-1 drugs, but they're saying that, insulin would make you hungry, and all these, they're discarding some of the mechanisms that we know that are physiologically relevant. But then at the same time, they're utilizing pharmaceuticals that work on the same mechanisms. And it's always kind of ironic, because if you don't really understand the physiology of things, it sounds logical, and you just go with it. And it's like, we got to dig a layer deeper. And I think a lot of people need to realize that we have to be intellectually honest with all things. There's things that are in physiology that you or I don't like, but they're true. And it's more important about being intellectually honest than anything else. But before you and I go on a diatribe, which we could definitely do for days.
No pun intended.
Yes, Scott, could you go over the pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamics of GLP-1 agonists as compared to endogenous GLP-1? So you mentioned previously that our naturally secreted GLP-1 generally lasts about 2 minutes. So it's very short acting. We see a very short acting half-life. but could you go over just some of the different forms of, say, semaglutide in terms of injectable form as well as oral form, and just how long they take in terms of how long they last in the serum?
Yeah, I think I've covered a lot of that. Just how it is that semaglutide is actually produced. The Rybelsus oral semaglutide is given every day.
Mhm.
So to be honest, I think a lot of that is because there's some degradation that occurs. I think the doses are higher for that, like 9 or 16, between 9 and 16 milligrams, if I'm correct.
And
Whereas,
they have dose escalation trials up pretty high, up to like in the 40s, to be honest,
yeah, yeah. Whereas, we're talking about 2.4 milligrams per week being a standard dose for
for
the injectable
semaglutide in the
version.
injectable form.
Injectable version, yeah. So basically, the molecules are the same. It's just the route of administration is what makes the difference. And again, it's a modification of the amino acid sequence, so that you still have this agonist property, the glucagon-like peptide agonist property, but it's defended against being broken down. So it just hangs
Absolutely.
around in the body. So you're just increasing the half-life. This is a standard pharmaceutical approach. We'll just take the parent molecule, wherever it is, and then we'll fill around with it. Um,
Modify it.
yeah, an example that's kind of interesting, and this is a totally different topic, is selective androgen receptor modulators, SARMs. And some of those are technically androgens, or they have the steroid backbone on them, and they bind to androgen receptor. And then others just like look at it like, for my untrained eye, I'm like, well, how the hell would that doesn't look anything like, it doesn't look anything like cholesterol or testosterone, but they still combine because one section of the molecule is matches up in terms of hydrophilic interactions and ionic interactions, et cetera, et cetera. So it actually binds to the active site of the receptor. So this is just this is a very simple modification of GLP-1 itself, so you don't have to take it every 2 minutes, which obviously wouldn't be very effective as a drug.
No, not at all.
So,
But it is kind of cool to look back because GLP-1 was essentially initially as a hormone, discovered by Daniel Drucker, I believe, in the 1980s. Then in 1996, they found out that it was a appetite suppressing hormone. But it wasn't until the 2000s that they actually got it from like one of these lizards, essentially, and they were able to extract it. And they started formulating, and you're very familiar with the previous compound that's still in the market, liraglutide.
yeah.
And that was essentially once daily where people had to inject it. And as time has went on, 2014, liraglutide gets approved as a weight loss medication. It wasn't until 2021 that semaglutide got approved as a weight loss medication. But we go from 2014, 10 years ago, it's once daily, you have to take an injection. For a lot of people, that's a higher barrier to entry. Then we get to 2021, where they have now semaglutide, which is once weekly. And then they go to Rybelsus, which is once daily, which is it's much harder to get. And there is some clinical trials in weight loss, but it's really being used for diabetes. However, I'm sure that as time goes on, and I have seen some postulations within the literature reviews by Drucker that has looked at the fact that we're looking at not only more potent, so we're looking at dual agonists like tirzepatide, which people use once weekly, but it has a half life about 5 days. And then also we're looking at triple agonists, which is this retatrutide, which is even more interesting in terms of its actions, but that's still in phase trials. And so,
Mhm.
really, what it comes down to is we're really lowering the barrier to entry as time goes on, which just makes these pharmaceuticals and these compounds a little bit easier to get people to utilize, as well as it makes it so that people can be more consistent. And I'm a big fan of just like whatever's going to get you in the door in a gym membership. If it's, I talk to my clients sometimes and they're just starting in the gym and it's like, do you have a local gym? Like, there's a couple instances. Do you have a gym in your actual work facility, in your office? If so, don't worry about getting a gym membership. Let's go there during your lunch break or right after work.
Super
Or
simple.
what's the closest gym? If there's a Planet Fitness, I don't care what it is. I don't have like I was a meathead for a long time, but I don't have any judgment. It's like I used to travel an hour to go to the gym. Nowadays, it's like whatever is on my way to and from work, or when I was still in an office structure. And it's like I'd say the same thing to clients. Let's lower that barrier to entry just to make it facilitative, not debilitative. Because if you have this long commute to the gym, or you have this once weekly injection you hate, or once daily injection you hate doing, and you're going to skip it, I would rather you have something that you would do consistently over, consistency 10 out of 10 times will beat intensity. So that's just one thing to just think about in terms of the drug preparation. But Scott, let's go down into the next section, which is going to be the positive effects of semaglutide. So Scott, can you take over and go through some of the positive effects of using GLP-1 receptor agonists? I'll have you take that section, and then I'll go through the physiological and pleiotropic actions on different organ systems.
Yeah, there's obviously the one we've been talking about, is that it reduces your appetite. So basically, it's going to reduce appetite. It also tends to reduce people's choices of food. So the things that would typically cause binges and that sort of thing goes down.
Mhm. Can
Um,
you just describe for the audience just how it's reducing appetite and decreasing, uh, food intake essentially? Like you could talk about kind of a little bit more like the gastric emptying rate. Like why is that? Because a lot of people hear this term, they're like, what does that mean? Like it sounds great, but we both know
mm-hmm.
like if you describe it a little bit better or a little bit more in depth, they'll understand why is decreasing gastric emptying rate doing like it has multiple mechanisms.
Right. So if you kind of think about your GI tract as a conveyor belt, right? And you've got numerous workers along the conveyor belt, and they're seeing like, okay, as these things pass along, each of the hormones that I mentioned before has to play a role. The pancreas has to do what it's doing. It's like, okay, how much glucose do we have? How much insulin are we going to need? How much protein's coming in? How much peptidases and proteolytic enzymes are we going to need? How much fat do we have? How much bile we're going to have to release in order to make sure that's emulsified so we can get that properly absorbed. So all of these things, the qualitative nature of the food that's been taken in is being observed. We've got to have a appropriate hydrochloric acid being produced in the stomach, et cetera, et cetera. But a big picture of that, so we imagine like you've got a conveyor belt with these three things: carbs, protein, and fat, right? And with carbs, you do this. With fat, you do this, and protein, you do this. So that might be easier if you have 10 workers there, they don't have to really do much. Just one of them, just like, okay, we'll just take this. We just got a small amount of each of these, so we don't have a lot coming in, right? But if we do have more coming in, then all of those hormones are going to react differently. One thing they're going to say is they're going to say, hey, you guys upstream, you're sending too much stuff down here too quickly. We need to stop eating so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Slow down the intake of food. So when gastric emptying is slower, that's going to happen in two cases. One, that the all those hormones are coordinating that, because you can only take the carbohydrate and the fats, the proteins, and bring them into the bloodstream so fast. So
Absolutely.
the system slows things down. If we have that slowing going on, what's also happening, for instance, there are nerves in the enteric nervous system that feed back to the brain to say, okay, stop eating. That's part of that signal. So if we just slow gastric emptying rate, that basically is one of the paramount signals for there's plenty of food coming in, right? There's no need to be eating. Stop the eating. Hunger goes down. It's time to, the meal is finished.
And that's
So
one of the reasons why you'll notice that individuals that utilize this will report what's called early satiety within a meal. So it feels
exactly.
like they they didn't eat as much as they're used to, especially like their first couple weeks on this. They're like, I was full before I would ever get full in a meal. I didn't even finish my meal. I tell many of my clients, I'm like, listen, we're gonna have to be very protein centric. Eat your protein first. You may only get through that protein and a little veg. You're not going to be able to get through, you may not be able to get through your carb source or your fat source, but I'm trying to
Right.
prioritize protein just for the lean mass accretion and lean mass maintenance benefits. But it's very interesting, but also I'm sure you can allude to this a little bit further. The gastric emptying also has metabolic benefits, because think about if we're slowing down the transport of nutrients, especially carbohydrates, then it's hitting our bloodstream much slower. So,
Mm-hmm.
less insulin secretion, let all these downstream implications, these actions, we're having less of those, less of a necessity for that. So it's having both satiety benefits, but also blood glucose management. And also, we're not seeing as much of a postprandial increase in blood glucose. And then also, due to the fact that we don't have as high of a peak in blood glucose, we don't need as much insulin to be secreted from the pancreas to cover that essentially, or to transport that.
And that's going to help with insulin sensitivity and reduce the possibility of becoming insulin resistant, which is exactly why this has been used for so long as a treatment for diabetes, at least
Absolutely.
in part, right? I'm not sure this is part of your question too, but then there's the direct effects of the GLP agonists on the brain itself.
Mm-hmm.
So slowing gastric emptying is going to have an effect in of itself. That's why, or increasing the size of the stomach slows gastric emptying. That's why an old trick during when you're dieting down is to drink a lot of water. So make it seem like fill your belly up so you have a gastric stretch, and that is going to slow gastric emptying potentially to some degree. But the direct effect on there's a direct effect on gastric emptying, and then the direct effect on the brain, I think, is a powerful one. So it's interesting if you look at the literature. One of the questions is, what's the mechanism whereby GLP-1 agonists would actually be helping with weight loss and fat loss? And although there is some evidence when you directly administer this directly to the brains of rodents, that they get an increase in basal metabolic rate, it doesn't seem to do that when it's administered systemically. So it doesn't seem to be jacking up metabolic rate.
No, and I looked into that for human randomized control trials, and we do not see that.
Don't see it, yeah.
No.
And you know, it would be.
It's also confounded by the fact that they're losing weight, so their basal metabolic rate is actually going down.
Exactly what I was saying. It would be nice. That's exactly where I was going. It would be nice if you could maintain BMR when it otherwise would be dropping as you're dropping weight. But there is one rodent study where the control group the animals became lethargic and spontaneous activity was maintained in the group that got the GLP-1 drug. I can imagine maybe in some cases, and I haven't seen this, but this would make sense to me. Maybe this will be borne out in future research. You take two people, and one of them they're dieting down. They're not using semaglutide. They don't have a GLP-1 agonist supporting them, and they're hungry, and they're hangry, and their energy levels are low, so their need goes down. Whereas someone
100%.
else is like, I'm not bothered by this. I'm not hungry. I'm not thinking about it. Like, I'm happy-go-lucky. So they just psychologically tend to do more things because they're enjoying life more so. They're less troubled by being hungry. And I can imagine that having effect, but and maybe potentially helping. I don't know how close the studies have followed, and this is a diabolical problem in nutrition research, which you know better than I, how close they followed actually how much people are eating. And
that's a very confounding factor, because oftentimes there is a couple studies we'll discuss later on where they did a run-in diet where there was no GLP-1 use prior. So they put them on an 800-calorie diet for an 8-week run-in to see the responders to that intervention. They found clinically significant weight loss of over 13 kilograms. However, then they put them on a GLP-1 agonist or a placebo to see the subsequent weight loss after that. And we saw that the responders who had lost weight initially, they lost a substantial amount of weight, lost even more on the GLP-1. Whereas the people that went just on the placebo, their rate of weight loss slowed down. However, a lot of the trials are not looking independently at nutritional intake. They're putting them in a 500-calorie deficit. But if we actually do the back calculations, the number one trial that probably has the most citations on this is the STEP 1 trial. And they lost approximately 33 pounds, 33 pounds over 68 weeks. So if we back calculate that, that's about 2.2% per week. They lost 15.3% or somewhere in that region over 68 weeks. However, if you back calculate that, they lost under 34 pounds in 17 months. That's under 2 pounds per month. So if we do the back calculations on a 7,000 calorie deficit over 30 days, that's around, I want to say, forgive me on my math, I believe it's 230 calories per day. I mean, I can do the math right now, but we're looking at a very small deficit in comparison to even the prescribed deficit. So there are some lack of dietary control as well as adherence rates, and they're actually not really tightly controlling that. They're really looking at the adherence to the intervention itself in terms of, are you taking this on a weekly basis? Keep in mind that these trials are much, much longer than any of the randomized control trials we have on nutrition. They are 6 to 8 weeks. There's some trials that are going up into almost 2 years. So we're looking at weight loss outcomes. And this is the confounding factor I have a little bit of an issue with, because I am a nutrition guy, is the fact that we're doing comparisons and people are saying, well, we never see this amount of weight loss in dietary studies. And it's like, Leibel and Rosenbaum have lost 10% off body weight in 8 to 10 weeks. But these trials are 68 weeks and they're losing 12 to 15%. It's like, we cannot compare them in isolation. We need to look at things in an isolated fashion in terms of, this is a nutrition study. But I will say the one thing that is advantageous is that when we look at some of the later clinical trials that are from 2021 and after, they started to utilize semaglutide in conjunction with IBT, which is intensive behavioral therapy, which means diet, lifestyle, movement, counseling, like essentially a coach, coaching throughout it. And they did see better weight loss outcomes in terms of totality of weight loss, their actual body composition, because they're actually, exercising and things of that sort, and then also maintenance of that. So there are some multifactorial benefits. This isn't, like I mentioned previous in the podcast, this shouldn't be looked at as monotherapy that you just throw in and say, this is it. I'm winging the rest of my life, but I'm using
Golden bullet,
GLP-1. That
magic
will
bullet.
not serve you long term. But I do want to get back just to some of the physiological and the pleiotropic actions of GLP-1 because it works on multiple systems. And I see a lot of people, and don't get me wrong, I understand this. I'm a body composition, expert and someone that's very physique focused. But I do want to go through some of the other, because I work with people of all different backgrounds, all different goals, metabolic issues, things of that sort. And we have to look at things from a multi-systems approach. And Scott, I know that you have an integrative approach. So I think you'll be appreciative of this, but I do want the audience to realize this is not just a weight loss drug. This is not like we need to look at all the downstream effects. So from a metabolic perspective, we'll start there, which is where the interest is for most people. So yes, it is going to decrease body weight, which is going to have downstream effects and benefits from a metabolic health perspective. So we see in the clinical literature that it decreases postprandial glucose levels, postprandial lipid levels. It's going to reduce blood pressure, and it significantly decreases inflammation, especially from a CRP perspective. I mean, there's some clinical trials that see 42 to 49% decrease in CRP. Like, that is incredible. Now, if we think about weight loss, we have to think about the fact that this is initiating weight loss and helping people lose weight. So what else do we know from weight loss trials? We know that 5% or greater of weight loss has positive effects on increasing insulin sensitivity, decreasing fasting insulin levels, decreasing fasting glucose levels, decreasing cholesterol and triglycerides, increasing HDL cholesterol. So there are many downstream implications that aren't really tested in the clinical trials in terms of semaglutide, but that's because we know weight loss induces that in and of itself, even if it's not pharmaceutically induced. Then at the level of the brain, it decreases appetite and body weight, which is going to help with inflammation and even brain inflammation, but it also increases neuroprotection. So there actually are some phase trials that are not completed yet, but they're actually looking at this for the treatment and for decreasing the prevalence or the severity of Alzheimer's dementia, as well as some other neurodegenerative diseases. So from a mental perspective, this is very beneficial. Then at the level of the stomach, like Scott mentioned, it decreases gastric emptying and it increases fullness. At the level of the pancreas, it increases insulin biosynthesis and insulin secretion from beta cells. It decreases glucagon secretion in the alpha cells, which are some of the main reasons that it's been used as a therapeutic treatment for type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, and insulin resistance. And really, when we look at it, when they're comparing it even against something like metformin, like they're looking at semaglutide as taking the cake on metformin. It's just not as easy to prescribe, first and foremost. Second of all, we're having shortages in terms of actual manufacturing, and metformin has like 70 years of clinical data. So it's still the first line intervention strategy for someone with type 2 diabetes. Then if we look at the level of the muscle, it's increasing insulin sensitivity. It's going to help to increase glucose uptake and really keep us more insulin sensitive. At the level of the liver, it decreases hepatic glucose production, which is actually one of the main causes of insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes. Your liver continues to produce glucose even in a state where it doesn't need to. Also, it's been shown to independently decrease liver inflammation. Then from a blood vessel perspective, it decreases blood pressure. So we're going to have a decreased pressure on that. And then it also helps with decreasing the buildup of plaque in the arteries, which can cause hardening of the arteries, which is atherosclerosis. Also, an interesting fact now, a lot of people, and I've worked with many people that have been on this, you'll notice that their ad libitum, so their natural hydration goes down. So their natural fluid intake, I constantly have to be on top of clients that utilize semaglutide. Like, listen, how much fluid are we drinking? Because they just don't feel thirsty. They feel a decrease in thirst. But also the issue with that is at the level of the kidneys, it decreases diuresis, or it increases diuresis. So there's a diuretic effect, essentially. So they're losing water. Then also, a lot of times people are being suppressed from an appetite perspective. So they're decreasing their carbohydrate levels. So now we're having a decrease in insulin. So they're not holding some of those solvents and those electrolytes. So it's almost like some of them experience like the keto flu, like they would if they went on a low carbohydrate diet, but they don't realize it's from the medication and the downstream implications. So I just want to give a heads up to people out there that they feel really foggy and brain fog. And they're like, man, this is the medication. Yes, but it's also because you're not repleting fluids and electrolytes, especially sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. So that's just a little bit of a heads up. And then at the level of the heart, this is one that really is close to home. I saw my father have a heart attack in front of me at 8 years old. So cardiovascular health is very big for me. So I have a couple clients that have come to me in a bad state from a cardiovascular perspective. I actually have 2 clients that had heart attacks right prior to coming to me, or have reduced ejection fraction, which is actually one of the areas that they're really looking at some of the trials for 2024 at looking at, I don't want to say reversing ejection fraction, but essentially improving ejection fraction. But we see that it has cardioprotective effects. It decreases coagulation so that your blood isn't as thick, it isn't as viscous. So this could be quite advantageous for your androgen users that have higher levels of, hematocrit and hemoglobin. And then it also increases cardiac output. So this is something that you may see that your heart rate goes up when utilizing the drug. This isn't everyone, but I will say that I have tracked this with individuals I work with, and their resting heart rate is higher. But then when it comes to heart health, the use of semaglutide was shown to cause a 20% reduction in heart attacks, stroke, and cardiovascular death, according to the SELECT trial, which was just recently released. So really, when it comes down to it, there are so many downstream implications that I don't want to just make it about weight loss. Yes, we are going to focus. I'm going to go into the weight loss trials. I'm going to go through that data, but I did want to shed light on the fact that this is having multifaceted benefits. That is why initially it's for type 2 diabetics. Like, we can't just think about this as a cosmetic drug, which a lot of people are, because we see celebrities in Hollywood that have utilized this drug, and it's like, oh, I just want to lose the last 10 pounds. I'm not here to place judgment on that, but I am trying to say that there are people that are in a state of metabolic dysfunction. So if we look at the statistics, I did actually a presentation, you were there for it, on insulin resistance and increasing insulin sensitivity. And 93.2% of Americans today are considered metabolically dysfunctional by one of the 5 metabolic syndrome criteria, meaning they have high blood pressure, high triglycerides, high blood glucose, elevated waist circumference. They have one of those clinical indices that is leading them to metabolic syndrome. And so really, we're in a state where a lot of people aren't healthy from a metabolic perspective. And this could be a type of intervention that could either kickstart your health trajectory or your health journey, or just get you in a better state. There's many Americans, over almost 50% of the population is pre-diabetic or diabetic. So it's like, these are things that, even if you're not body composition focused, sometimes we need to look deeper and layers, peel back layers of the onion, do lab work. This is something I'm very adamant about with my clients. Like, don't guess, let's check. And so these are just some other benefits that we want to look to, because I think a lot of people have, especially in the fitness space, there are many coaches, many trainers alike, and I was in this position a couple of years ago when this was only approved for diabetes. I was not for the use of semaglutide for cosmetic weight loss because it wasn't even clinically validated for weight loss. So I saw people getting it off label, and I'm never trying to judge, but I did think that that was taking away from individuals that really needed the drug, which were type 2 diabetics. Now, keep in mind, I have a familial history of type 2 diabetes. My father actually went to get this trial to get liraglutide, and was denied for it from our medical insurance. Unfortunately, we actually had to dose him with insulin to keep his blood glucose in check. Now, these were early days. I mean, he passed away way before semaglutide came out. So I saw the fact that individuals that really needed help from these type of GLP-1 agonists were in a state that they couldn't get it approved or couldn't get it essentially prescribed for them. So at that time, if we go back even in 2020, I was kind of adamant about the fact that if you were just using this for cosmetic weight loss, you shouldn't. But now that I'm 4 years removed, I've learned so much more. I've worked with so many more clients over the years. It's like, yes, I'm not saying that everyone out there that needs 5 to 10 pounds, I don't think that this is a necessity. However, there are so many people that have comorbidities. So they have excess adiposity, but then they have, they're pre-diabetic, or they have high blood pressure. They have all these other indices where they're going to need to use a medication regardless. So this may be an adjunctive therapy to use in conjunction with lifestyle, dietary, training modifications.
Yeah, I mean, my pie in the sky idea would be that everyone just turns into health and fitness fanatic, and they just start, doing everything they possibly could. But that's just not the nature of our world. That's just not how things are. Those epidemiological statistics are just really horrendous.
No, only 17.1% of people in industrialized countries around the world, including the United States, Britain, as well as Australia, are meeting the physical activity and muscle strengthening guidelines, which are 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity and 2 or 3 strength training workouts a week, which are like 30 minutes. So 17.1%, my man, we got 83%. We got to get on board. So unfortunately, as much as I am on the same page with you, I would love to get everyone loving just moving their body and eating well. There are some barriers to entry that we really need to knock down the doors to. So this is almost where, like, when we'll go later into like practical applications or how to utilize this with clients. And it's like, dude, if this is the life raft you need, by all means, take it.
Yeah, the thing that's really cool, and you mentioned a lot of these things, there's actually direct actions on bone. This has been used to treat like fragility models in animals, and the actions on neurons are direct as well. So as far as potential molecules or hormones or things that we can create drugs on, this one does a pretty good job of actually being something that there's been this search for an exercise mimetic for years, right? And why this is really called an exercise mimetic, it doesn't increase metabolic rate in that sense. That's sort of what's typically thought there, but it creates so many of the metabolic outcomes in a very direct way that are associated with weight loss, either indirectly by causing the weight loss through the appetite effects, or then its direct pharmacodynamic actions, that it's really kind of flabbergasting. It's so like it does this and it does that and it does this and it does that, and the list seems to go on and on. So if there's a drug that, I mean, you mentioned DNP, like that's the one I've done the same way. Stay away from that. That's the exact opposite in terms of it's something that can help with weight loss. There's no doubt there, but in terms of health effects, it's the devil incarnate. Like this is not what you want to be doing. Whereas a GLP-1 agonist prescribed by your physician is something that actually has numerous direct health mediating effects at a biochemical level in a way that sort of falls in line with what happens when you do take on a better diet. You have to take care of it. But this is the one of course, with any pharmaceutical, with any drug, with anything, you look at bodybuilding in its extreme, and it can be a very, very unhealthy endeavor. But you take someone who's weightlifting 3 or 4 times a week, right, and they're exercising in the right amount, it can be a very healthy endeavor. You take this drug and give it to someone who then who takes that as a launching pad, it can be phenomenal. There will be people, of course, who are just, abusing this. Well, if 2.4 milligrams or better, I'll see if I can get my doc to prescribe me, or I'll go and I'll, just like people do with pain meds, and they'll try to get a dual prescription or something like that, right? See if 4.8 doesn't do the trick. So that's always going to happen. That's just human nature. But this is a really good, as far as medications go, this is one that is I could kind of stand behind, because I think it's potential to help a lot of people out of the situation that we just find ourselves in. This is just the nature of our society now.
100%.
We're 100 years ago.
If we look statistically, 73% of Americans are either overweight or obese. So this is really where this could, like I mentioned, this could be a life raft for many people in today's society. But let's get into the weight loss outcomes of GLP-1 trials. So seeing as the clientele I work with are very body composition focused, I want to cover the weight loss outcomes of some of the best GLP-1 receptor agonist trials that we've had come out over the last few years, as this is the area that most are focused on and aiming for when using a compound like semaglutide, aka Wegovy, which is what it's clinically indicated for weight loss. So right now, only a few types and brands of GLP-1s are clinically approved for weight loss purposes, including liraglutide, which is a daily injection, semaglutide, which is known by the name Wegovy for weight loss, and then Ozempic for diabetes, and then tirzepatide. And so the first GLP-1 that was approved for the treatment of chronic weight management was liraglutide in 2014, which goes by the brand name Saxenda. Then in 2021, semaglutide was approved for the treatment of obesity under the brand name Wegovy. And so GLP-1s promote weight loss through 2 main mechanisms. First, as we mentioned previously, they delay gastric emptying, which increases or causes an increase in fullness, which is why so many people report early satiety and being able to eat less, and thus being able to maintain a larger net calorie deficit. And then second, they signal and they increase satiety. And this is by directly acting on the appetite circuits and centers in the brain and in the hypothalamus. And so they cause a profound effect on appetite suppression, which leads to experiencing less hunger. Now, research has found that even just a low dose of semaglutide of 1 milligram per week for 12 weeks was associated with less hunger and food cravings, better control of eating and also people's eating behaviors, and then also a lower preference for high-fat, hyperpalatable foods. And they also found that after 12 weeks of treatment, ad libitum, which means to like satiety, calorie intake, was substantially lower with semaglutide versus a placebo, with a corresponding weight loss of 5 kilograms or 11 pounds over those 12 weeks. So about approximately a pound per week. Now, when it comes to the degree of weight that's lost from semaglutide, the most well-known series of studies on the topic are the STEP trials, which are randomized control trials using once-weekly semaglutide in adults with overweight or obesity. Now, the trial that started all of this off and really put semaglutide on the map essentially for weight loss was the STEP 1 trial. And in this randomized control trial, they took adults with either overweight or obesity and randomly assigned them to either a placebo group or a once-weekly semaglutide injection group of 2.4 milligrams per week, plus a lifestyle intervention to aid in weight loss. Now, over the course of 68 weeks or 17 months, the mean change in body weight from baseline to week 68, so over those 17 months, was 14.9% in the semaglutide group, which came out to an average weight loss of 15.3 kilograms, which equates to around 33.5 pounds. So what we're seeing is that the use of semaglutide in that maximum dose, which is that 2.4 milligrams, can achieve a rate of weight loss of around 0.2% per week and a little under 2 pounds of weight loss per month. So it's not, I want to make this very clear, it's not quick weight loss. But if this compound is used long-term, like it has been in the STEP trials, much of which are over 52 weeks or over a year, it will lead to clinically significant weight loss. Now, the latest GLP-1 drug that's been approved for weight loss is tirzepatide, which is a dual GIP and GLP-1 agonist that goes by the brand name Mounjaro, which is what many people are familiar with, but that's actually for diabetes. But also in end of 2023, it was approved as Zepbound for obesity. And so this is a really powerful weight loss agent and something that I think is going to become more and more prominent as time goes on. Now, keep in mind, it was just at the end of 2023, so we're only a few months into this even being an approved agent for weight loss. But in one of the trials, which was the SURMOUNT-1 trial, they took adults with obesity and put them on a once weekly injection of tirzepatide at either 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams, or 15 milligrams for 72 weeks. And they did this over a 20-week dose escalation. So this trial was long as could be. It was 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was 15% weight loss with the 5 milligram dose. They found a 20.9% weight loss with the 15 milligram dose. So we're seeing like substantial weight loss. However, I think in the coming years, the show, when it comes to GLP-1 receptor agonists for weight loss, are going to be the triple agonists, which I don't see a lot of people talking about, but there's a compound called triple G, which is also referred to as retatrutide. And this has been yet to be used or to be essentially approved for the treatment of obesity, but this is a triple agonist. So this works on the GIP receptors, the GLP-1 receptors, and the glucagon receptors. And the phase 2 of this trial that just came out last year found that after 48 weeks, the 12 milligram dose, which was the highest dose over those 48 weeks, lost 24% of their body weight, which is fucking substantial, man. That's the highest I've ever seen. This is really comparative to bariatric surgery. Then the 8 milligram group, which is the second group, was 22% weight loss, and the 4 milligram group lost 17.1% weight loss. And even the lowest group, which was only 1 milligram, so it was 1/12, the max dose, still lost 8.7% body weight. So I believe in a few years, everyone's going to be talking about retatrutide. And the reason I bring that up is because I want to be first to the crowd. You guys heard it here first. Me and Scott laying down the land. But it's extremely impressive. When we look at bariatric surgery, this is something that, first of all, about 1 in 1,000 people die on the table, unfortunately. It is something with a high risk. There's a lot of downstream implications. I've had a couple of friends that have went through gastric bypass, either a sleeve or many of the different surgeries, and it's a brutal process first and foremost. And so if this is an alternative that is yielding very similar weight loss outcomes, I mean, if you look at bariatric surgery, generally between 20 to 30% weight loss, this is going to be life-changing for some people.
Mm-hmm. Any idea about long-term side effects from the triple G approach?
There's only 2 trials that I could find, and they did report higher side effects for like gastrointestinal stuff, which is something that I do want us to cover actually.
Sure.
However, I'm just not sure if they were more substantial because we don't have enough clinical data on it. So for instance, with the GLP-1s, we've known about GLP-1s. They first were patented in terms of an actual medication in 2005. So we have around 19 years of data on a lot of the exenatides and things like that. We just don't have on the triple. Now, mind you, those are only GLP-1 agonists. Now we have triple agonists. So now we're looking at different receptors. What are the downstream implications on that? And I don't want to speak too soon on that. So that is something I will keep on top of the literature. I'm sure you will as well, Scott. But you know what? You actually get me into our next, like, let's talk about that. You know, for every gimme, there's a gotcha. So, Scott, can we go over some of the downsides of these GLP-1 receptor agonists just on the GLP-1? So we don't have to worry about GIP or glucagon receptors, but I do want to provide a balanced perspective on the topics that those in the audience are educated on both the costs and the benefits of using these compounds. So what are some side effects that you are familiar with and maybe things that people should just keep their eye on? Or just really, be an informed consumer if you are to partake in this or develop an interest in it. Because we don't want to just highlight, yes, there are some great clinical indices and outcomes and benefits, but there are also drawbacks.
Of course. I mean, the devil wants his due, right? The thing you mentioned about potential dehydration and electrolyte imbalance issues is, I think, super important. Especially, I'm thinking about like my situation here in Florida, where it's just hotter than heck, and the humidity is gigantic, and I mean, I can get dehydrated,
You know what's very interesting about that? I don't hear a lot. I hear people say dehydration. I don't think people understand the physiology of hydration, first and foremost. I know you do because you are a master at peak week, so you manipulate very many variables. I won't mention your tactics and stuff. That's something you and I still have to discuss in private. However, there is actually some cases which we're seeing acute kidney injury. And I don't see
Mm.
anyone discussing this, but if you really dig in the literature, Drucker is like the only person I've heard,
Wow.
I've seen write about this. But it's not that GLP-1 drugs are renal toxic or kidney damaging, because there's actually trials that are looking at it as it's not nephrotoxic, essentially. It is renal protective. Now, here's the
Mhm.
thing. It's lowering blood pressure. It's increasing indices. It's actually helping with EGFR, so ejection fraction. However, the issue with this is that a lot of these drugs, like I mentioned to you, increase diuresis and decrease thirst. Plus, let's think about one of the other effects. There's GI effects. One of the main effects is increased vomiting. So what that can that cause? A lot of people don't realize it can cause an acute kidney issue. But you
pH
have to
problems as
you
well.
have to understand these things, and many people don't.
Yeah. I've got a friend who whose partner was using, I think he was using semaglutide, and he had nausea like none other. He was throwing up. He had diarrhea. He had the full litany of issues as far as gastrointestinal distress. He did not have hypoglycemia. That can happen too, and that's just because he had it was helping with his blood sugar, but hypoglycemia can potentially happen as well. Um, I think the issue can be, and this is a behavioral one, and we're still talking about human beings here. We know this from working with athletes and just people who want to lose weight. I've heard so many times of people who um, and wrestlers pop to mind, they do this too, will want to intentionally reduce their fluid intake because someone who's been battling the scale, so to speak, for years, and now they see it finally dropping down, and they realize that if they drink less, the numbers lower.
They also
That's
look
gratifying.
drier a lot of times.
You look drier. Oh yes, worse if you're we're not talking now we're talking about bodybuilding athletes, and yeah, of course. That's why you just take your sodium out 4 weeks before your show, so you'll look drier, right? Or at least for a short period of time. But someone who just has been battling the scale and they start to lose some water because they take in less water, they may consciously or subconsciously pick up on that. And then they stop drinking as much because of the effects of the drugs. And then you've got an issue where, yeah, like you said, people could run into renal problems. Um, a double whammy there potentially just occurred to me is if you do have someone, because you do find, for instance, when people stop smoking, that there's also an effect on other behaviors. So like I stop smoking and then they start eating better and they start exercising. Take someone who's not like acclimated to exercising in the heat, or they're not accustomed to exercise, and they start losing weight and they have all these positive life changes, and then they start exercising. If you're low on fluids and you do bump up against what might be something approaching rhabdomyolysis, and you don't have enough fluids in, then rhabdomyolysis can indeed cause an acute kidney injury. That can be pretty bad.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, I know of a story from the research literature where they were just training the elbow flexors. They were doing a muscle damage study, and there was one person who was a responder, as you might say, and he had to be rushed to the hospital because he was having kidney failure just from exercising that small amount of muscle. So you add the dehydration from lack of fluid intake and electrolyte imbalances on top of an exercise regime in the heat, and not intentionally reducing you could be potentially asking for kidney issues. Um,
100%.
so other things that I found, you may have dug some other things up like semaglutide, um, at least in lab animals, may have an increased risk of thyroid cancer. I don't know if
Medullary
you know.
thyroid cancer, but we do not see
Yeah,
that. Rats and mice also have different cells
yeah.
that are more predisposed towards actually inducing cancer. We don't see any of that in human trials, though.
No, no. But the question would be, this is the pointer. Animal research is a pointer. So why would that be causing cancer? What's going on there to cause those cells to become
Proliferated.
immortal and proliferate as cancer cells do, right? And liraglutide has caused gallbladder, or at least gallbladder disease and pancreatitis too.
100%.
Um,
Now, the
yeah,
issue with
so
that
that's out
is
there.
we actually see an
Yeah.
increase in that. However, The other issue with that is that we know that there's a necessary amount of dietary fat. Now it's very low to make sure that you don't get gallstones. You need enough bile essentially. But it's interesting. You need about 7 to 12 grams of dietary fat just to make sure that we have clinical trials that look at actually very, very low fat diets and what induce gallstones. And then that's obviously going to have downstream implications on gallbladder health. It's about 7 to 12 grams. But if someone is literally not eating whatsoever, and I hope that if you guys take one of these compounds, that you're really working with a qualified professional to really give you dietary guidance. And even if your appetite's suppressed, I would rather you get highly satiating foods and take a much lower dose and really get the most out of the least, rather than blasting a dose, not eating at all, and thinking, oh, I'm going to lose as much weight as quickly as possible. There are going to be downstream implications. So we see a lot of, first of all, with the higher the dose, the dose escalation, the more prevalent it is to have GI side effects. So we see that the most prominent or the most commonly reported side effects are GI related. So that's going to include things like vomiting, nausea, constipation, and diarrhea. And a lot of research finds 70+% of individuals using these compounds will experience one of these GI related side effects, especially during the first 8 weeks of the trial. However, we also see it as they do a dose escalation. So if you actually look at the trials, there are 20-week dose escalation. So a lot of them do it over quicker time scale. So it's 8 to 16 weeks. We see a lot of times when they do 20 weeks and they continue going up, they continue seeing GI effects. So it's almost like, I don't want to say a linear dose response because they're not postulating that. But if you look at the GI incidences over the weeks, you see that it keeps continuing to climb. So that's one thing. Another thing that I really want to get across, and this is not something that's reported in the literature, but they also don't have a lot of quality of life indices that they're looking at, and they're not getting subjective feedback. But as a coach, that's what I care about. I want to know someone's biofeedback. I see a lot of fatigue and lack of energy. A lot of people feel like they don't have the energy that they previously had. Sometimes that's it's improved initially because they've lost some weight, so they feel a little bit lighter on their feet. But a lot of people feel lethargic and fatigued. A lot of people that were fit and are just using this for like the last 20, 30 pounds, they notice that their performance in the gym has decreased. Now, obviously, this is confounded by the fact that they're eating less, but there's this, I don't know, this general lethargia that they report that it seems almost compound induced. Another thing is dizziness that people will get, whether that's hypoglycemia related or not. I've had clients check their blood sugar. It's not always related to their actual blood glucose levels. So sometimes they're in a healthy range, but they still feel dizzy. Their vision is a little bit impaired. Then we also see the loss of lean mass, which is an issue that we need to really focus on. Another thing that is a side effect, or not a side effect. I want to say this is a drawback rather than a side effect. So this is not a physiological impact, but we have to consider the practicalities of this drug. This is a very expensive drug for many people, especially those that are not getting this prescribed for a condition like obesity or diabetes. And so generally semaglutide is only going to be covered for someone with type 2 diabetes or someone that is in a clinically significant weight category that is, obesity related. So if you are not have an excess adiposity, it's going to be very expensive. So oftentimes what I see is clients that they're paying if they're getting a semaglutide for weight loss, but they don't fit those categories of type 2 diabetes, an over 30 BMI, or they don't have a 27 BMI and over and a comorbidity like type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome. They're paying $1,000 or more per month, it's a huge expense. We can't discount that. So unless you're in a really good financial position, you may want to invest in other things first and then think about potentially utilizing this in a microdose fashion, or utilizing this in a manner which is going to allow you to get the most out of the least, essentially. So besides that, the other thing I do want to cover is
Let me throw one thing in there if I can too, because you're right. It's kind of confounding, like these side effects of getting dizzy and reduced performance. These are things that are going to happen when you're dieting, just plain and simple. So if someone is using a drug that ablates your hunger, it's kind of like throwing turbo into a car that's maybe not meant to go that fast, and all of a sudden you need to take good care of everything that's going on. So with your diet, everything else you're being prescribed to do from your physician or from the professional that you're working with, you need to take care and realize that you can go maybe 10 hours without eating anything. You're gonna feel dizzy potentially if you don't do that.
Very true.
You become superhuman, and you've ablated these normal signals, which would cause behavioral responses. So in order to counteract that, you just have to be smart about how you do things. Make sure you get enough protein, for instance. Make sure you get the electrolytes, all that kind of stuff, because now you're enhanced, so to speak, in a certain way, and that now you're a super soldier, a dietary super soldier who can do things sort of has been programmed by the pharmaceutical to be able to weather the storm of a diet where you might otherwise be thinking, I'm getting pretty hungry. I probably should eat another meal here. Whereas you're not going to have that knock, knock, knock on your head telling you eat something because your appetite's so suppressed. So, and people who don't have experience with dieting and piecing all those puzzle pieces together to have an effective diet and make sure that they keep their performance intact as possible, much as possible, they're not going to know this. They're just being put on this super speed, super fast sled right into massively effective weight loss.
But
And
it does come with downsides as well. So
you have to be able to support the weight loss with all the other behavioral approaches that we just mentioned. So yeah, there's some negatives there. It's, you got to take care of yourself, while this is happening was one simple way to say it.
absolutely. So two things I want to cover before we go into the practical application section is I want to cover the likelihood of weight regain after utilizing and discontinuing these drugs, and then also the propensity or the likelihood for lean mass. So one of the drawbacks of these drugs is that they seem to be long-term interventions, meaning there's a high rate of weight regain upon the discontinuation of the drug, especially as many individuals using these drugs are using them as a first-line treatment for weight loss and haven't dialed in their diet, their training, their physical activity levels, and their lifestyle. And it is true that while you're on a compound like semaglutide, it'll suppress your appetite enough to cause you to eat less, lose weight, and also to improve your metabolic health. But if you do not have the fundamental habits and behaviors in place to maintain that weight loss with those habits after you stop using the drug, you're predisposing yourself for rapid weight regain and potentially the body fat overshooting effect, which is where you rapidly regain body fat after a diet due to having lost weight quickly and having lost lean mass in the process. And the reason that that is an issue is when we see that when someone loses lean mass throughout the course of a diet and a substantial amount of lean mass, they get to what's referred to as a hyperphagic response, which can cause you to overeat until you regain the lean mass you lost during your diet. Now, the issue is that fat mass can be gained far, far quicker than lean mass is. So the majority of people in this situation essentially slingshot and they overshoot their previous body fat percentage, which is where, which is why there are so many cases where there's individuals who have lost 20 to 30 pounds in a drastic like crash diet, and then they've regained 25 to 35 pounds quickly. So they've regained more than they lost. And so they end up heavier and carrying more body fat than they had to begin with prior to either, starting the dietary intervention or even utilizing this drug. Now, when we actually look at the research on the maintenance of weight loss after stopping the use of semaglutide, we see a high likelihood of weight regain. So in trials in those with obesity, semaglutide tends to lead to an average weight loss of around 12 to 15%, which is an impressive loss, but most of these trials are a year or longer or more, especially those that are most well known. So those are going to be the step 1 trial. So if we actually think about it from a coaching perspective, many of us have achieved similar weight loss with clients within much shorter timescales and have also done so by improving their habits and their behaviors around nutrition, training, and movement, which has allowed for better weight loss maintenance after the dieting phase has ended. Especially as someone like myself who's been coaching for a decade plus, like I already have a post-diet metabolic restoration phase that I transition all my clients into after they finish losing a substantial amount of fat. And that's because my goal is not just to help clients lose body fat and get lean for a vacation or a photo shoot or whatever goal that we're currently aiming towards, but it's also to be able to maintain a lean, healthy physique year round. However, this is not what many that use these drugs are doing, unfortunately. So for example, after the step 1 trial that we covered previously, where they had, they essentially compared a group where they received a once weekly 2.4 milligram injection of semaglutide with a placebo group. What they ended up doing was Wilding and colleagues, the same research group, did a trial extension where they looked at the weight regain and cardiometabolic effects after discontinuing semaglutide use. And in this trial extension, they took a portion of the semaglutide group who had used the drug for 6 to 8 weeks, and then they followed them for another 52 weeks or a year to see how they did without the drug. Now, the average weight loss in this specific group, they actually took like what were considered hyper responders. So instead of just losing 14.9% as the group average did, these individuals had lost 17% of their body weight. Now, over the next year, this group regained 11.7% of the weight that they had initially lost. So they were down to a net loss of 5% of their body weight, which amounts to a weight regain of over 68% of the total weight that they had lost. Now, keep in mind that this trial extension was 4 months shorter. It was 12 months rather than 16 months. So it was actually shorter than the active weight loss trial. So they were on semaglutide or on the drug for longer than they were off of it when they ended the study period. So had they, essentially done an equated study where they did a 68-week period on semaglutide, and then they followed them up for another 68 weeks, we may have seen different outcomes in terms of they probably would have regained even more, because that was, if you look at the weight regain trajectory, it continued going up in terms of their actual weight course trajectory in the charts. And so in this study, they also looked at the cardiometabolic improvements these individuals had made during the 68 weeks of semaglutide use. And they found that these reverted back to baseline metrics. So back to where they were originally within a year of stopping this drug. And so really what we see is that a lot of these drugs, they're being used as monotherapy. They're just being thrown into the mix. And it's like, we're seeing substantial weight loss outcomes. We're seeing substantial benefits. But as soon as people discontinue this because they don't have fundamental habits, behaviors, lifestyle ingrained and built in, they are reverting to their previous set point. They're reverting to their previous body composition level and impaired state of metabolic health, which is something that we as practitioners need to be very cognizant of. And you as people that are just trying to improve your body composition, your health, have to be aware of. Now, Scott, I know that you've looked in and you've dug into the research on some of this recidivism, essentially, or the maintenance after. So did you want to go over, you had sent me over a study by Rubino and colleagues. Do you want to go over that a little bit just to elucidate some of these findings in terms of weight regain and also the reversal of some of these benefits?
Yeah, it shows the same pattern. They did the sort of the typical run-in in this particular study. This was from Rubino et al. 2021, 2.4 milligrams a week, standard treatment. And what they did at 20 weeks was they switched half of their subjects to a placebo. So that's interesting in of itself. I always wonder, oftentimes you don't see sort of a debriefing where they asked the patients or the subjects, did you know you got a placebo? Because that's very important, right? Some people don't know they're on a placebo, and thus they will have tremendous effects because they think they're getting the real deal. But they lost in the first 20 weeks like 10% of body weight, and then they carried this study out for another 48 weeks. Same sort of thing. Over the next 48 weeks, the group on the placebo basically lost half, roughly half, or regained half of the weight they previously lost. And the other group that stayed on the semaglutide made it down to about 18% body weight loss. So at 68 weeks, so we're like a year and 4 months, they were plateauing off at about 18% body weight. So that's where they probably were going to stay. If you look at the placebo group, they're steadily climbing. They only followed for the next 48 weeks. I don't know. We don't know what would have happened. I mean, maybe there's a follow-up study on the way out, or maybe one that I haven't seen in the literature, but they were heading back towards potentially a fat overshooting phenomenon. It's interesting. It would have been interesting to see what would have happened then if they said, okay, now you don't get your placebo, right? In both of those groups.
Would it have been even worse?
Yeah, if you could have done a third group, no placebo, or
essentially label them a withdrawal control group.
Right, exactly, and let them know you're not getting any goodies. Like you get
so
nothing.
You don't even have the psychological benefit of thinking that you're still, because what Scott's trying to allude to is the fact that the placebo group is still getting a once weekly injection. It just doesn't have semaglutide in it. So they are unaware of the fact that they're still not getting the pharmaceutical drug. They're still following the same program. They're still going through the motions. Obviously, at some point, they have to realize that their hunger is coming back, but it's also a long half-life. It's going to build up in your system over time. So it's not like, week 1 after the placebo, they get off it, that they're going to be cognizant of the fact that they're no longer receiving it. And plus, there is a very big psychological and placebo phenomenon of the fact that if you think you're on something, oftentimes it will, I come from the supplement industry initially. There are some placebo-controlled trials which look at supplementation studies, which they give a placebo of caffeine and real dose of caffeine. And it's based more, your physiological response, like your performance, is more based on what you were told the caffeine dose was than the actual caffeine dose given. And that is something, caffeine is one of the ergogenic aids that has the most literature behind it, knowing that it is performance enhancing. So it's extremely interesting to think about this in the context of oftentimes the mindset is a huge determiner of your results.
It's amazing. There's a dose response study with cyclists where the ergogenic effects follow the dose response of the placebo they were told they're getting. And you think you would know if you're getting caffeine or not, right?
Absolutely.
So that's kind of what I was alluding to. The placebo group, They may have known, they may not have known. Some may have been, and there's a whole, you can look up Ted Kapchuk. He's someone who is, he used to be an acupuncturist actually, and now he's sort of specialized in trying to elucidate the pharmacogenomics of the placebo effect and what's going on there. So people have certain propensities to placebo effects, and you can actually co-administer drugs or substances that will impact the genes or the enzymes that are involved, for instance, for dopamine production in the brain, and your expectancy of whether your placebo or the thing you think you're getting is actually going to be effective. So, yeah, you wonder what happened to the placebo group. Did the ones that thought like they knew after, like, okay, I'm not getting it anymore, I can kind of tell, and there's others that thought they were still getting it. Is that a potential application of this? You figure out, this would be, I'm getting off topic a bit, but you do a genetic screening on someone and say this person's amenable to a placebo effect. And can you then say, just drop their dose in half? So they don't know, once they reach their goal, they don't know they're getting a half dose, or drop their dose entirely. They don't know because they are amenable to a placebo, where some people, they wouldn't know. Or they'll know right away, like,
Yeah.
I know I'm not on the drug, because they're doubting Thomas, so to speak. And then look at what would have happened if they completely removed the placebo and said, nope, you're getting nothing. Would that have been like, oh, like kind of an abstinence violation type of effect? Like, oh my gosh, now
All
I
bets
don't,
are off.
all bets are off. Oh my gosh, oh shit.
I've lost my
And
magic beans.
right, I fell off the wagon, and now do they just revert back twice as fast? And same thing with those who made it down to that plateau. Like, I wonder also if there's maybe some sort of a threshold where people start really enjoying the new version of themselves that they are, where they then start taking on by themselves those other benefits. Let's say someone has an aversion to going to the gym because they just don't like how they look and feel, and now they start becoming someone new. Maybe once you get someone down to where they've lost 18% body fat, or maybe it's just 10 or 12% for the average person, then they take on those things, and then you can remove the drug and give them a placebo. I hate to be paying a doctor 1,000, because if you're going to make a placebo work, you got to make sure they're actually believe that they're getting it. So do you
Absolutely.
charge someone $1,000 for the placebo? There's no drug there. I don't know. That's an ethical issue. It's difficult, but anyway, so that study showed reversibility. It didn't follow out, but it also showed a plateau. I think maybe that's one of the topics you want to talk about, whether maybe at the end, whether there is some down regulation or loss of sensitivity to the drug. But in this particular study, they were reaching a plateau at, in this case, 68 weeks.
Absolutely. All right. So
So
I'm going to transition us. We have 3 more topics. We're going to try to get it in. I have a call at 5 p.m. So we got
all right,
18 minutes. We're going to try to get through it.
do it.
But the next one I wanted to cover, and this is something we need to cover because many people in our audience are very body composition focused. And I also think that it's imperative to speak about the fact that there is a potential for lean mass loss with GLP-1 agonists. And the reason that that's an issue is that the loss of lean mass has negative downstream implications. So we're going to see a lower metabolic rate and total daily energy expenditure. We're going to see a higher likelihood for weight regain after discontinuing the drug. If you do lose lean mass on the drug, you're going to see a worsened body composition from a lean mass to fat mass perspective. Now, this is where I have to be very cognizant of the fact that I work with a lot of people in menopause, a lot of women in their 50s, a lot of men in their 50s, 60s. Now we're at a higher predisposition, if you go on these drugs, to potentially increase the risk of sarcopenia in those who are older. Then also the potential loss of bone mineral density due to extreme weight loss, especially if someone is menopausal and isn't on hormone replacement therapy and isn't going through skeletal muscle loading. So I'm putting a lot of things into the equation, but you have to keep in mind, I work with people of all different demographics, and we always have to think about, we can't just think about the 25-year-old or 30-year-old that's trying to look good on the beach on the summer. Yes, I work with many people like that, but honestly, the majority of my clientele are between 35 and 55. So I am always looking at this age demographic. What could potentially impact them from a hormonal perspective or pharmaceutical perspective, a lifestyle, a training, a movement perspective. So to my knowledge, as of right now, there are only 2 studies that have measured body composition outcomes after taking semaglutide and have found them that they cause a much higher loss of lean mass than weight loss dieting does itself. So when we look at dieting by itself without exercise, the often quoted figure that you'll hear many people in the evidence-based scene say is that we lose 25% of loss of weight from lean mass. Although earlier research did find that to be the average, this may vary a bit from person to person and sex. There are sex differences between them, but there's actually a new study that was released in the beginning of 2024 done at the Pennington Biomedical Research Center, which found that the proportions of weight loss as lean mass and muscle range from 10 to 23% during calorie restriction alone. That means we don't have a protein intervention. We don't have resistance training. So what we're seeing is 10 to 23%. Now, regardless, we're seeing higher amounts of lean mass being lost when on GLP-1s. So for example, in the step 1 trial on semaglutide, they found that those in the semaglutide group lost about 39% of their weight from lean mass. So more than a third of their weight loss came from a loss in lean body mass. And then also a review on the effects of GLP-1s on lean body mass in humans found that in over half the studies identified, the proportion of lean body mass reduction ranged between 20 to 50% of total weight loss. So we are seeing downstream indices in terms of we're losing a lot of lean mass in this process. So this is something you have to be very aware of. And that's really where we got to get into how to use this with different clientele. And this is more of the practical application section. And so what I'm going to do is, Scott, I'll take the lifestyle clients and then I'll have you can take the applicability for bodybuilders and physique competitors. And we can go through, I'll go through first what I think is the usage for those in lifestyle, like the general population. And then we can go through a little bit of the maybe the applicability for those that are in the physique space or in the bodybuilding. I mean, for those out there that don't realize, you know, I have a lot of lifestyle clients and general population clients that listen to this, as well as coaches and stuff. Like Scott has coached Mr. Olympia, so he's been at the highest level of the sport in terms of from a coaching perspective. So I do want to get some of your feedback on just, you know, that population essentially. So ultimately, I kind of, you know, what I want to get across is I see GLP-1 agonists as an adjunctive therapy that should complement someone's diet, their lifestyle, and their training. However, I work with real people who have real problems. So if someone is drowning, this may be a life raft for them. However, as a coach, I think it's important that the clients I do have who use these compounds have certain variables in place to set them up for success, not only now, but in the long term. So this is why I focus on building the habits and lifestyle that a client will need to succeed long term, whether they're on one of these GLP-1 agonists now or they're not, or they're discontinuing the use. And the main issue right now is that a lot of people who use these drugs don't have the lifestyle habits in place currently to succeed long term. So what I'm talking about is that they don't have a healthy dietary pattern which they consistently follow. They don't consume sufficient protein to begin with. So once they go on these drugs, they essentially become protein deficient. And they also don't have training and movement practices in place that are really going to cause a stimulus for the retention and the building of lean mass. So they're not, you know, training in a progressive resistance training fashion. They're not incorporating movement and physical activity. So they don't have these fundamental habits. Now, when it comes to the lifestyle clients, I believe these compounds are best for. I'm going to go through a couple of categories that I've seen both work in practice and then also just some maybe theoretical categories which you guys out there may align with or fit into. So I found this to work with those with metabolic health issues. So I work with many type 2 diabetics, those with obesity, and then also some that are suffering with metabolic syndrome. I have another category of individuals that many would label as weight loss or metabolic resistant. So these are individuals that have been struggling for an extended period of time to lose weight or have a very extended dieting history where they have a lot of downregulations in the hormonal axes. They have a lot of resistance to the process of weight loss going forward from a physiological perspective. And then I also see this as being something that can help break a plateau. So I have a lot of individuals that I've helped lose between 40 to 60 pounds, so substantial weight loss. And it's just, they still have more to lose. So I have certain clients that have been, you know, in the upper close to 300 pounds. And it's like really to get them to their goal, it would have required, or, you know, when we're looking at this from an objective perspective, probably 80 to 90 pounds of weight loss, but we're really stuck between 50 and 60. So really to get them to the goal, it could require another 20 pounds, but I'd have to bring them to their lower intervention point, which is a podcast in and of itself. But Scott, you and I have talked off air about this. To get to your lower intervention point, that's where all the physiological systems are pushing back on you. So leptin's low, ghrelin's high, thyroid's downregulated. You're facing all these sustained metabolic adaptations, which are going to persist. And it's going to make the process very, very difficult to, because you're essentially getting to what for you, it may not be on paper, you know, essential levels of body fat. But if you are someone that walked around at 30+% body fat and now you're at 15% and you want to get down to 10 to 12, it's like that is such a massive reduction from where you're at. It's the same as a bodybuilder going from 15 to 5%. And in the brain, the mechanisms that are going on, your leptin's really low, your brain's pretty much screaming at you to eat. So it's going to be very difficult to get down to that level. And that's where utilizing this could be a plateau breaker for a certain period of time. Now, I've also had some individuals who have come to me and they started the drug about a month out, from us working together. So they came to me, they said, listen, I just started semaglutide, say 4 to 6 weeks ago. And for some of them, it's been used as like a life raft or a Kickstarter. So they actually got inspired to come to me as a result of the fact that they had started something that they knew was going to help them with weight loss, and they felt more locked in or bought into the process. So regardless of your situation, I want to really get this out there. I really believe that if we're going to utilize these compounds and these pharmaceuticals, start low and only titrate up if necessary. Let's get the most out of the least. And as a nutritionist, a trainer, a physique coach, I do think we must focus on building a solid foundation to be able to transition off of the drug or titrate down to a lower maintenance dose if you are someone that has been utilizing the maximum dose. So there are some individuals that come to me at the 2.4 milligrams, and it's like, I've been utilizing this for 6 months to a year. I cannot afford to utilize this. And I don't want them to look at these things as all bets are off. So really, when it comes down to it, we need to lay the foundation, which means I'm focused on building a diet that's built off of, has a foundation built off of nutrient dense, low energy density, high satiety foods. And really why I'm doing that is because most people can't afford to run this compound at the commonly used dose, which is that 2.4 milligrams, which all the literature is tested on essentially due to the cost or due to the side effects they experience. So really what I'm trying to get them to do is get more out of less. And I also think there's a need to focus on sustainable lifestyle changes, such as developing better eating habits and behaviors. And this is a huge thing. This is a conversation I've had many times with those that are either interested in semaglutide or on semaglutide that come to me. You cannot just continue to eat the same hyperpalatable, tasty foods that aren't satiating and expect to be able to not only continue doing that and losing weight, but also to be able to continue those habits after you get off the drug, because you're no longer going to have the appetite suppression. So I think it's really important to have informed consent as someone who's going to either take these drugs or someone that's getting off these drugs, because there's a high likelihood of weight regain. And we know that, just like Scott and I went over, that there's a high likelihood of reversal of both the weight loss and the metabolic health benefits if this is not approached in a very strategic and I guess calculated manner. So we can really help you through this process, but you need to be willing to buy into it.
Yeah, there needs to be an exit strategy, just
100%, just like after a show.
After you with bodybuilding competitions, right? Like the coaching doesn't end after you get off stage. You got to have at least the next 8 weeks or longer planned out, or maybe even the next year, depending. So, on to, I think you wanted to talk about for contest prep or for bodybuilders. There may be some people who tend to overeat in the off season, but normally, for bodybuilders, the issue is trying to support the gastrointestinal system when you're pushing food way beyond what your appetite would normally typically lead you to eat. So, obviously, when someone's dieting down, the same situation they'd be in if they're a lifestyle client, so to speak, or someone who just naturally has a higher body fat, it gets tough, it gets difficult. So one thing that has always sort of been my hypothesis is that if someone is dieting down and they're constantly food focused and they're stressed out by that, and like they're driving along and they're smelling every burger joint as they go by, and they seem to constantly be seeing food, and they're basically distracted and having to constantly hold themselves back to eliminate that appetite and that food focus and that constant stress on their willpower is something that could, I think, potentially, at least hypothetically in my mind, have an effect on body composition, because your cortisol, you're going to be less stressed out. Your cortisol levels are going to be lower, for instance. And I've seen people who were in just the caloric balance, who have gone through horribly, and when they're dieting down as well, have gone horribly stressful situations, and they just lose muscle mass, like they've been injected with a virus that gobbles up their muscle fibers. So that's something that I think maybe for someone who tends to whittle away, maybe because they have to do a lot of cardio or what have you, there's potential application there. I think for people who tend to binge, that happens a lot. This is an obvious potential solution.
So we're actually seeing this and this is starting to get put forth in the clinical literature, looking at this for food addiction and then also for, I don't want to say it's disordered eating behavior such as binge eating, the impulse. It's helping to shift
Yep.
those food preferences from
Right.
hyperpalatable, highly addictive, dopamine, essentially stimulating foods, to be able to shift those preferences over. They are utilizing this as a treatment for those that have binge eating disorders. So that is
Mm.
actually very in line. And we know, unfortunately, the ugly side of bodybuilding is that a lot of people, they almost plan their binges right after their shows. So this could be
Oh,
really where I see this almost most applicable is actually post show, when many people go through that post anabolic, post contest, quote unquote, anabolic rebound, which is really just an adipose rebound because you aren't gaining any tissue immediately post show unless you're blasting drugs.
right, right. Um, yeah, especially then the one of the things that I think um, that's nice about having an oral version here, for instance, there is one particular study with oral semaglutides showing that it increased fullness satiety after a high fat breakfast.
Yes, it
So
did. Yes.
imagine that day after
That
the
same
show,
study,
you
they
go
show
out.
that same group found actually another study where they did a longer term study. Same research group found a shifting in food preferences and actually a lower, I guess, a lower likelihood to eat high fat, high carbohydrate foods.
Yeah, Blundell was the
Yes.
person on that. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think he was in that person was in both studies. I'm just his lab or what
Yep.
exactly, but um, so yeah, so there's this potential to just minimize those binges, and the assumption here too is that we don't have, and this is where working independently as an individual with each person is going to be important. If someone is deciding to use this, of course, it has to be doctor prescribed, right? That's the idea that they would have prescription because the coaches can't be prescribing this. But you don't have someone who, and I this has been a topic that's come up recently in some other conversations, is that you do have some people who, and this is a bodybuilding tendency, more is better. The harder I can diet, I have to suffer, I have to do extra cardio, and some people just drive themselves into the ground. This could be a recipe for disaster.
Disaster. We're
Yeah,
also that's a big issue with those that had a previous history with anorexia and bulimia, where a lot of clinicians are actually worried about the use of these drugs that many people, because there are physiological rate limiters in the system in terms of hunger and appetite sensations, that many
mhm,
with anorexia, they're close to death as it is. That is the number one
sure.
eating disorder with the highest prevalence for death, unfortunately, for mortality.
Mhm.
This could put them in a situation where they're able to override those internal mechanisms from a hunger signaling perspective, where they
Yep.
literally could starve themselves to death, which is very scary to think about.
Oh, I can see of someone who's suicidal, who's got anorexia, for instance, and just decides they're gonna basically end it by using a large dose of this and just not eating for the next week and a half. That would be it. That's unfortunately, hopefully I'm not giving you any ideas, but that's a possibility. In the context of bodybuilding is to some degree, and this is how I've done diets in the past. Some people count every calorie and they know what they're going to eat. And when you're working with a coach, typically he's like, "Tell me what you're eating, and we'll take out a half a cup of rice or what have you." But I've having been on stage for over a couple of decades and dieted for like 40 some shows, I was able at the end there, especially the last maybe 10 years or so, I just knew how hungry I was supposed to be. I knew I needed to eat these meals. And of course, I did whittle things down. There was a titration process that was followed, but every diet was different. And one of my guiding rods was indeed how hungry I am. And of course, it had to match everything else that goes along with dieting down. But if you then just ablate that appetite, then for me there will be a lot of guesswork. It's like, okay, well, I probably should eat something. Then I would have to revert back to having a standardized diet because I wouldn't have that constant check mark in the back of my head saying, "Hey, dude, you need to probably eat something because you're getting just diabolically hungry." Which for me and for many bodybuilders is not a problem. It's part of the deal. I went through even worse diets when I was a kid, when I was wrestling, when I was eating one meal a day, and 1,000 calories a week as part of a silly wrestling diet to try to drop weight classes. So I could handle the hunger, but I still need it there to tell me what's going on. So this could be a situation where, and you probably had clients like this, is you've got a standard diet, you're supposed to do this. They're complaining of hunger, they get a prescription, they start taking the drug, and they're like, "Oh, well, now I'm fine." And then they come back a week later for the next check-in and they've eaten 50% of what they're supposed to and they lost 8 pounds. Like, what the heck
Yeah, I
happened here?
think That is
Yeah.
something I'll tell you from my own practice, is that
Hmm.
getting in tune with your satiety and hunger signals is something that I very much talk about with a lot of my clients. You should feel hungry during a deficit. Your body is in a deprivation of calories, a deprivation of energy, and we need to separate physiological hunger from psychological hunger. Physiological hunger is a need for energy. There's energetic demands. You're at a negative balance or energy balance. Whereas psychological hunger is driven by dopamine, is driven by your surroundings, your environment, the fact that you're in a social atmosphere where everyone else is eating and drinking, or that you've been exposed to food cues, whether that be marketing, advertising. You smell something as you're driving past a bakery. These are not, you're bored. Emotional issues, like you encounter some stress at work, you get a nasty email from Karen, you get in a fight with your spouse. Those are coping mechanisms that need to be facilitated elsewhere. However, a lot of times what I've had to have conversations with, I actually had this conversation with a client of mine yesterday about the differences between physiological hunger and psychological hunger, because she has been on semaglutide for quite some time. And there are times that she just veers off and she eats a lot of hyperpalatable foods. And it's like, but were you actually, and she'll tell me she's hungry, but it was more so when we really dig in, we peel back the layers of the onion. She realized it, and she said this yesterday. You're right. It's that I have a drive for these foods. I've been fortunate that they have lowered my cravings for these foods, but I still have a lot of those habits and behaviors that when I go out with my husband or my boyfriend or whatever it may be, I go out with people that are in my life and they still have those same habits because they're not into fitness like I am. I essentially fall back on those habits. And luckily, I'm able to stop myself earlier than I would previously, because it would have been an overeating occasion. But I'm still, what I try to get across to her, you're re-ingraining these same habits that you eventually want to get off, because that is her goal. I said, listen, we need to really work on the fundamentals in this next phase of this program together, because I need to put you in a situation to succeed for you to have the fundamental habits that we can titrate down this dose and get you to a place where you have such great foundational habits from a dietary, a movement perspective. There are so many things that are involved in appetite regulation. Also, your ability to manage psychological stress, look at different outlets and different coping mechanisms. We need to get those systems in place so that everything's unlocked. That the only adjustment is going to be on your titration of your dose, and all those other things are going to come into play. So right now, you're eating lower satiety, higher palatability foods. Now let's switch that and get higher satiety, lower palatability foods that have less drive for passive overconsumption. And then we can titrate down the dose, and you're getting an equivalation, essentially, of, like, we're equating your hunger now. You're at the same level, but you're using less of the dose. You also have less of an expense, and you feel less in her. She doesn't want to be reliant on it, which is one of her reasons for getting off. So there are many downstream factors that come into the equation, that whether you're doing this yourself or you're working with a coach, there's many conversations that need to be had, factors that need to be considered. This isn't a willy-nilly thing. That's why in the beginning of the podcast, I said, listen, Scott and I are not here to tell you to take this or not to take this. We're here to educate you and empower you through this source of education, to give you an evidence base as well as a well-balanced perspective on a topic that is very hot. But oftentimes there are people that are doing podcasts on this that have a hormone replacement clinic, or they want to drive their weight loss program or their challenge. Like, you and I have no dog in the race. We just want to help you.
Yeah. Another sort of feature of being hungry and feeling hunger, you've got the psychological aspect. How are we doing
Yeah, 3
time-wise?
minutes.
Oh, okay, sorry, I'll try to make this
No
quick.
worries.
Um, which you just spoke of, people will self-soothe for hunger, there's social components, all those sorts of things. And also, there's something that comes with being able to step outside of your hunger from a third person perspective while you're hungry. And in one side, say that, okay, yeah, the reason I'm eating here, I'm thinking about eating, is because I just got triggered by an ad or whatever it is. And also, there's maybe a personal growth experience of saying, gosh, that's just hunger, right? I'm not going to die. I know I'm not starving now. I'm not going to die from this. And the same thing can then be applied elsewhere in your life. It's like, when I'm training, it hurts, but it's supposed to hurt. I'm trying to create a training stimulus that's painful. And I can go and do that, and I can be a master of my reactivity to the signals that my body sends me. And I'm going to make good use of them to know, okay, this hunger tells me I need to eat. And this hunger is just a discomfort that isn't suffering, because I realize it's there, and I'm sort of allowing it to be without being reactive to it. So when you're on a semaglutide or a GLP-1 agonist, or a drug that just artificially suppresses your hunger, you're not able to make those internal psychological adjustments that are different. What you spoke of, I think it's sort of another subset of being able to just look at the physiological hunger and say, okay, it doesn't matter that much to me. It's just physiological hunger. It's going to be just fine. So I'll leave it at that. I know you got to run. We've ran over our 5 o'clock
All
time.
good, my friend.
Time
As
limit.
always, Scott, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I will have all your stuff linked up below. Is there
Cool.
anything else you want to leave our audience with before we sign out for the evening?
That's it, my man. I think we
All
covered
right, brother.
everything possible.
Oh yeah. All right, guys. As always, thank you again for listening to another episode of the Chasing Clarity podcast. As always, you guys can find us on Thursdays here on Spotify and iTunes. If you guys have any questions for me, any feedback, feel free to reach out to me on my email, which is bdecruzfitness@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram, which is at BrandonDeCruz_. Thanks again. Have a great weekend. Peace.
Adios.